Today we're looking at Unit 5, Notes number 3, America Gets a New Deal. So the election of 1932. So this election is between Herbert Hoover, who is the current president, so he's running for re-election, and the challenger is Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He's challenging Hoover for the presidency. So a little bit of background on both. Franklin Roosevelt is a Democrat. He's the governor of New York, so he has political experience. He comes from a wealthy and renowned family. He is the cousin of Theodore Roosevelt, who was president at the early part of the 1900s. He always saw Theodore Roosevelt as a role model, kind of aspired to do similar things in politics as Roosevelt did. And so he's popular as a reformer. So he's known in New York as someone that tries to solve problems, goes after issues. FDR fought poverty and unemployment in New York while he was governor. So Herbert Hoover was elected in 1928, right before the Great Crash, and then the Great Depression happened. So at this point for the election, his approval ratings are in ruins. Hoover has little chance at re-election, and many people blame him for worsening the Depression, and America was looking for change. So Roosevelt gets elected. So it's a little bit about Roosevelt and his legacy. So Roosevelt gets elected president 4 times. So this is the only time this ever happened. This is before term limits are actually put in place. So he's elected in 1932, 1936, 1940, and again in 1944. And so for many Americans, he was alive through some of the worst periods of their history throughout the Great Depression, then into World War II. So he's known for just kind of going through these huge events with the American public. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt beats Hoover by 7 million votes. FDR's greatest asset was his overwhelming optimism and confidence. He had this can-do attitude that was exactly what America needed at the time. They wanted to feel that the person, their president, their government was there to help them, to work with them through this crisis. And FDR offered that sense of support. FDR was extremely charismatic and a master communicator who spoke to Americans as friends. So the election of 1932. And so this gives you a map of what the election results look like. So again, you have the electoral votes. And just based on electoral votes, you see it's a complete landslide. It's almost every state voted for Roosevelt. And so with electoral votes, whichever candidate gets a majority in that state, they get all of the electoral votes. So now we see at the bottom the popular vote. So there is somewhat of a discrepancy between the two because it makes it seem like there was no one in those states that voted for Hoover, but some people did vote. But the majority of people elected Roosevelt. They wanted a change. So here are some pictures about Roosevelt. One thing that the American public did not know about Roosevelt was that he had polio as a child, and so he had limited use of his legs. So he's often pictured either sitting or already standing. He's never photographed or videotaped walking, so the American public does not know that he has those ailments. You know, if he's driving a car, he is using, he has special cars made for him where he can use like a handbrake versus like his pedals so he can control what's going on. So it was definitely a different time in our media where they kind of respected the privacy and people didn't feel that disability impacted his ability to be president. So waiting to take office. Before taking office, FDR began planning to fight the Depression. So something else that was different back then is that now, once the president is elected, he gets inaugurated in January. But back then, the president didn't get inaugurated until March. So he had a lot of time after he was elected president to plan for how he planned to tackle the problems of the Great Depression. So first, he convened an elite group of advisors known as the Brain Trust, because even though he's the president, he doesn't know everything. And really smart people ask advice. they get advice from experts. So he called in economists and professors and historians and had people let him know, how were problems like this handled in the past? What can we do today? If we do this, what would be the possible outcome? So FDR designed a series of policies that would become known as the New Deal. And so he ran on this slogan of giving the American people a new deal. That, new chance, a new start, let's start over. So New Deal programs would combat the economic problems of the Depression through public works and direct relief. So FDR's New Deal had 3 goals: provide relief, recovery, and reform. So on March 4th, 1933, Franklin Delano Roosevelt becomes president. And so his first 100 days, he takes off running. He works the Congress to get programs passed. So FDR implemented over 15 New Deal programs during that 100 days that would expand the federal government's role in the national economy over an intense period from March to June of 1933. So this is, again, changing the role of government. So under Hoover did not believe that it was the government's role or responsibility to provide direct aid or services to the American public. And so FDR changed that, where now the government is starting to step in. So the New Deal takes on reform. And so the idea of reform is key, because reform means change, but it's also change to improve. So with the Great Depression and the Great Crash, it identified many problems that existed in our economy. And so the idea was to address those issues, but then also reform them or fix them so they wouldn't happen again in the future. Okay, so first thing that FDR wanted to tackle was banking and finance reform. So there was the bank holiday. So the bank holiday happened one day after FDR took office. FDR ordered a bank holiday, which would close all banks and stopped panic withdrawals. He knew that banks closing and the American public not having confidence in banks had to be fixed. So during the bank holiday, the Emergency Banking Relief Act was put into action. So FDR authorized the Treasury to inspect all banks for stability, closing bad banks and allowing only strong banks to reopen. And so one thing that Roosevelt did was that he talked directly to the American public. He had radio addresses known as fireside chats. And with these fireside chats, he'd let the public know, we're going to have a bank holiday. We're going to have government officials go and inspect the banks. They're going to determine if those banks can reopen or if they have to stay closed. And so once banks were able to reopen, once these kind of investigations were finished, the public knew, oh, I can trust that bank. I can go and deposit my money there. And so it allowed for a transparency in what was going on and for people to understand the process. So then there was the Glass-Steagall Act. It created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, FDIC, which insured bank accounts up to $5,000 and up, and protected people's money. And so FDIC is still around today. So if you go to a bank, what that means is that your money that's deposited is insured by the government. The government is saying if this bank were to close, if something bad were to happen, the government is guaranteeing your money will still be there. And so what this does is it prevents banking panics. So if something were to happen, people know my money's there, I don't have to withdraw all my money right now, and it creates a sense of security. You guys are probably too young, but around 2007, 2008, we kind of had a little bit of a banking panic when all those mortgages started to fail and banks started to fail. But we did have some banks close, but people's money was secure. And so we could have had a lot bigger ramifications to our economy had FDIC not been in place. And so if you go to a bank, anything like Bank of America, Chase, or even Downey Federal Credit Union, they will have a sign on the door that says FDIC insured. And so then you know that that bank is protected by the government and your money is safe. Also, reform measures was the Securities and Exchange Commission, the SEC. So the SEC regulated the stock market and made it illegal to rig the stock market with insider trading, speculation, so all those risky practices. Now this commission would oversee the stock market to make sure things like that did not happen. And so if they are happening, people can go to jail. They are breaking the law. So the Bank Holiday, Emergency Banking Relief Act, Securities and Exchange, these are all examples of reform. So we are identifying problems and we are fixing them. So the effect, consumer confidence in the banking system was restored and Americans began to deposit their savings back into banks, making money available again. So the New Deal stimulates recovery. So now with the economy, it needs to recover. We need to have people need to have jobs so they can buy things and spend money. And so these programs will focus on that recovery aspect. So stimulating recovery. FDR launched programs to help farmers and agriculture recover. The Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, paid farmers to leave a portion of their field unseeded. So one of the biggest problems with agriculture was overproduction. So when something is overproduced, you are creating a surplus and it actually devalues the crop. And so farmers after World War I did not adjust for the fact that they did not have to produce so much. So it seems kind of weird at a time where many people were homeless and didn't have food, that the government was actually telling farmers don't grow so much, or in some cases burning some of their crops because they had to adjust for crop prices and making crop prices valuable again. So reducing the surplus of crops would raise prices and increase farmers' income. The Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA, was constructing dams in the impoverished Tennessee River Valley. It would create jobs because people were creating the dams, building them. It would provide flood control for the region, irrigation, a way for them to use the water to water their crops, and also a source of cheap electricity to the area. So here are a few pictures of the area within the TVA, the men that were working on creating the dams that would create this source of hydroelectrical power. And so again, an example of the government creating a program, putting people to work, but it's also providing a service to the area in terms of flood control and also electricity. So the New Deal provides relief. And so one thing people need is they just need help. They need to find a job, they need to have money, they need to be able to pay their rent. So providing direct relief. FDR also created programs aimed at creating jobs through public works. The Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, gave jobs to young men ages between 18 and 25 to build roads and public parks. So again, the government is paying these people to do a service. And so they're creating things like roads and parks that are needed, but at the cost of the government, because these people need to pay rent, buy food, buy gasoline for their cars. So these men would live at the job site and they would send their money home to their families. And so while they were at the campsites, they were fed and they were housed, provided a place to live. So the Public Works Administration, the PWA, gave money to states for jobs to construct schools and public buildings. Again, maybe libraries, airports, things that were needed at the cost of the government. The Civil Works Administration, the CWA, created 4 million jobs in construction and school teacher jobs. So the point of this is to see that the government is deciding that, hey, there are no jobs, so we need to create the jobs. We need to find jobs for people to do, and they will create and build things that are needed in the country as a way for them to earn money. So here are a few propaganda pictures and just these public works projects in action. A lot of times you'll see plaques on bridges that will say like constructed in 1933 as part of, a WPA, PWA project. And so you know that they were constructed during the New Deal. So while these programs helped, FDR provided additional aid. The poor and the needy required direct relief. The nation's industries needed to be reformed to promote growth. Homeowners who were buried in debt needed assistance. So this leads to more of the New Deal, more relief, recovery, reform. So here are a few more programs that were created by the New Deal. Something you might notice is that almost all of these programs have an acronym, the AAA, CCC, TVA, and so the New Deal programs were often called the alphabet soup, just to kind of, there's so many of them, and even in these notes I don't talk about all of them, I'm only highlighting a few of them. So more relief, we have the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the FERA, granted $500 million in food, clothes, shelter, and work programs for unemployed, sick, and the aged. Homeowners Loan Corporation, the HOLC, provided new low-interest home loans to Americans who are struggling to make payments, so helping them to refinance their mortgages to make it so that they can afford to stay in their homes and still keep paying their mortgage. Reform, the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, insured home loans for Americans with good credit on tight budgets. So the FHA is also a program that still exists today, so it helps people to get home loans. And recovery. The National Industrial Recovery Act, the NIRA, created the National Recovery Administration, which set price controls, wage levels, and work hours to promote fair competition and end layoffs. So trying to work with our labor unions to ensure that workers are being paid a fair price, so that people aren't striking, but also making sure that they aren't being taken advantage of. So this is the end of the notes 5.3. Make sure you worked on your key terms.